Investors now view France as a riskier bet than Greece. Yes, the same Greece that nearly brought down the Eurozone in 2011. France's borrowing costs have surged past those of debt-riddled nations, and the country just lost its fifth prime minister in less than 2 years. This isn't just political theater. This is Europe's second-largest economy unraveling before our eyes, and the warning signs have been hiding in plain sight. To understand what's happening to France, we need to look past the headlines about government collapses and angry protests. The roots of this crisis run deep, and they've been growing for decades. France's public debt now sits at a staggering 116% of its gross domestic product. That's roughly 3.3 trillion euros, or about $3.8 trillion of accumulated borrowing. For context, that's behind only Greece and Italy among European Union nations. But here's the kicker. Unlike those countries that were forced to undergo painful reforms after the 2011 debt crisis, France kept spending. The numbers tell a sobering story. France's budget deficit reached 5.8% of GDP in 2024, nearly double the 3% limit established by European Union rules. The government needs to find a way to close this massive gap, but every attempt to do so has triggered political chaos. When Prime Minister François Bayrou tried to pass an austerity budget in September 2025, proposing 43.8 billion euros in savings, including cuts to public sector hiring and suspending pension increases, he was voted out in a confidence motion. His successor, Sébastien Lecornu, lasted just 27 days before resigning, making his government the shortest-lived in French history. These aren't just parliamentary squabbles. Each failed government means another delay in addressing the deficit, and markets are taking notice. The political gridlock traces back to June 2024, when President Emmanuel Macron made what many economists now call a catastrophic miscalculation. After his party suffered losses in European elections, he dissolved parliament and called snap elections, gambling that voters would rally behind his centrist coalition. Instead, the vote splintered the National Assembly into three roughly equal blocs: the far-right National Rally, the left-wing New Popular Front, and Macron's weakened centrists. No coalition holds a working majority, and the opposing factions agree on virtually nothing except their willingness to bring down governments they don't like. This paralysis has turned France into what one economist described as the weak link in the Eurozone. Here's where things get particularly troubling. France isn't just spending too much, it's spending on the wrong things. By far the largest strain on public finances comes from social protection programs, especially pensions. French state pensions are generous by developed country standards and available from an earlier age than in most rich economies. In 2023, pension payments created a 6.6 billion euro annual deficit, projected to balloon to 15 billion euros by 2035. Yet when Macron tried to raise the retirement age by just 2 years to 64 in 2023, mass protests erupted across the country. The reforms eventually passed, but the political cost was enormous. Now, under pressure from the Socialist Party, the government has frozen further pension reforms until after the 2027 presidential election. That's political survival, not economic policy. The spending problem extends far beyond pensions. France is Europe's biggest spender relative to its economic output, with government expenditure consuming 56% of GDP, the highest in the EU. The country provides an array of benefits that most nations simply can't afford. For instance, families who employ a childcare worker or nanny for children under 6 receive financial support from the government. The state compensates taxi drivers for transporting certain patients to medical appointments. These might sound like reasonable social benefits in isolation, but they add up to a system that, as one former economic advisor to Macron put it, reimburses a lot of things that we basically can no longer afford to reimburse. Meanwhile, France's ability to grow its way out of debt is weakening. Economic growth is projected at just 0.7% in 2025, down from 1.2% in 2024. The European Commission forecasts growth will creep up to only 0.9% in 2026, well below what's needed to stabilize debt levels. This sluggish expansion isn't just bad luck. Political uncertainty is crushing business confidence. Manufacturing managers reported a 6% decline in confidence in October 2025, prompting companies to delay investment decisions. When businesses don't invest, productivity stagnates, wages grow more slowly, and the tax revenues needed to pay down debt never materialize. Labor productivity, the amount of economic value each worker produces per hour, has fallen sharply over the past decade and remains well below its pre-pandemic trend. This represents what economists call permanent damage to the supply side of the French economy. The corporate sector is sending distress signals too. Business bankruptcies reached historically high levels in 2024, with most sectors feeling the pressure. Many companies still struggle with heavy debt loads accumulated during the COVID pandemic and the energy crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. High interest rates and shifting consumer spending patterns have made survival even tougher. The low-growth environment means corporate failures are expected to remain elevated through 2026, creating a vicious cycle. Failing businesses pay less tax, employ fewer workers, and require more government support, all of which worsens the fiscal picture. What makes France's situation particularly alarming is how markets are reacting. Credit rating agencies have been steadily downgrading French debt. Fitch cut France's rating from AA- to A+ in September 2025, citing persistent political turmoil and erosion of fiscal credibility. Moody's and S&P followed with their own downgrades and negative outlooks. These aren't just symbolic judgments. Lower credit ratings mean higher borrowing costs, and France has a lot of borrowing to do. Interest payments on government debt are expected to rise from 2.5% of GDP, about 67 billion euros, in 2025 to 3% by 2029. That's money that could go to schools, hospitals, or infrastructure, instead being paid to bondholders. The spread between French 10-year government bonds and German bonds, the benchmark for safe European debt, has widened dramatically. Before the June 2024 elections, this spread averaged 53 basis points. After the political crisis began, it jumped to 74 basis points. That 21 basis point difference might sound technical, but it represents billions in additional costs. Since the snap election, France has issued 457 billion euros in debt with a maturity longer than 1 year. Economists estimate the political turmoil has added 6 to 7.5 billion euros in extra interest payments that French taxpayers will shoulder over the coming decades. Perhaps most striking is this. By late October 2025, French bonds were trading at higher yields than Italian bonds, traditionally seen as one of Europe's riskier sovereign debts. France's borrowing costs had even exceeded Greece's at certain points. Bond market participants call this the work of bond vigilantes, investors who discipline governments by demanding higher returns when they judge fiscal plans to be weak or politically unworkable. When that discipline turns harsh, as it did during the Eurozone debt crisis, entire economies can be brought to their knees. The European Central Bank provides some protection against a full-blown debt crisis. The bank has tools like the Transmission Protection Instrument that could theoretically intervene if French bond spreads became so extreme they disrupted monetary policy across the Eurozone. But there's a catch. To qualify for this support, countries must comply with EU fiscal rules. France currently doesn't. While the ECB has hinted it might show flexibility in how it applies these criteria, betting on a central bank bailout isn't a fiscal strategy, it's a prayer. And prayers don't balance budgets. What happens if France can't fix this? The scenarios range from unpleasant to catastrophic. In the optimistic case, the political deadlock eventually breaks, perhaps after the 2027 presidential elections bring a government with a clearer mandate. Meaningful reforms get passed, spending gets controlled, and debt gradually stabilizes at uncomfortably high but manageable levels. That's the hopeful version. Less optimistically, the paralysis continues. Debt keeps climbing toward 125% of GDP by 2029, as some analysts project, and France finds itself seeking support from the International Monetary Fund with the same kind of harsh conditions that Greece endured. The IMF doesn't just lend money, it demands austerity measures, structural reforms, and oversight that effectively curtails national sovereignty. For a proud nation like France, that would be politically explosive. The worst-case scenario involves contagion. If France, representing about 1/6 of Eurozone GDP, spirals into a debt crisis, the shockwaves would ripple across Europe and beyond. Italian and Spanish bond yields would likely spike. banks holding French debt would face losses. The euro itself could come under pressure. What makes France's crisis particularly complex is that it's not just economic, it's deeply cultural and political. As Pierre Moscovici, head of the French Court of Accounts and a former finance minister, observed, excessive spending is a national characteristic and part of our social contract. France built a generous welfare state that citizens have come to view as a birthright, not a privilege that must be paid for. Any politician who tries to scale back benefits faces street protests and electoral punishment. The Yellow Vest movement that paralyzed the country in 2018 and 2019 demonstrated just how volatile French politics can become when people feel their standard of living is under threat. Now, unions and opposition groups are mobilizing for demonstrations under the banner Bloquons tout, block everything, aimed at resisting austerity measures. Some observers warn this movement could dwarf the Yellow Vests in scale and intensity. When a country can neither afford its current spending nor politically tolerate cutting that spending, you have what economists politely call an intractable problem. Meanwhile, public frustration is growing. Gallup polling from 2025 shows confidence in France's national government has plunged 13 percentage points to just 29%. Trust in elections, the judicial system, and financial institutions has similarly cratered. Most striking, 27% of French adults now say they'd like to move abroad permanently if they could more than double the percentage from 2024. That 16-point jump is virtually unprecedented in global polling. When over a quarter of your population wants to leave, that's not just an economic crisis, it's a crisis of national confidence. The far-right National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen and her protege Jordan Bardella, is capitalizing on this discontent. The party now polls around 30 to 33%, making it France's largest political force. Its rise presents yet another risk. If the National Rally wins the presidency in 2027, as current polls suggest is increasingly likely, markets will face massive uncertainty about France's commitment to European integration and fiscal discipline. Some analysts draw parallels to Italy's 2022 elections, when concerns about a populist government briefly rattled markets before cooler heads prevailed. But France isn't Italy, it's bigger, more indebted, and more central to European stability. There are no easy answers. The math is brutal. To bring the deficit below the EU's 3% threshold by 2027 would require a structural primary effort, meaning spending cuts or tax increases of nearly 3% of GDP, on top of adjustments already needed in 2024. That's roughly 80 to 100 billion euros that must somehow be extracted from an economy that's barely growing and a population that's already among the most heavily taxed in the developed world. France's tax and social contribution revenues already amount to 45.6% of GDP, the highest in the EU. There's limited room to squeeze more without triggering capital flight or crushing economic activity. The tragic irony is that France has many economic strengths. It boasts world-class infrastructure, globally dominant companies in aerospace, luxury goods, pharmaceuticals and energy, and a highly educated workforce. Paris remains a center of innovation and culture. The country successfully hosted the Olympic Games in the summer of 2024, showcasing its capabilities to the world. But these advantages are being squandered by a political system that can't make hard choices and an economic model that promises more than it can deliver. For now, France muddles through. The government functions in caretaker mode, passing temporary spending authorizations to keep the lights on, while politicians negotiate over budgets they probably can't agree on. The economy grows slowly, debt accumulates, and the day of reckoning gets postponed, but never canceled. Each prime minister who falls, each failed budget, each credit downgrade moves France a little closer to a crisis that everyone can see coming, but no one seems able to prevent. The question isn't whether France's economic model is sustainable. Clearly, it isn't. The question is whether the political system can summon the courage to fix it before markets lose patience entirely. And with bond yields rising, credit ratings falling, and 2027's presidential election looming, that patience is running out faster than most people think. Can France avoid a full-blown debt crisis? Or is Europe's second-largest economy heading for disaster? Share your predictions in the comments. And if this opened your eyes, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We're tracking the economic crises that could reshape the world.